Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is the good, the bad, and the woolly, ups and downs of England's sheep history. And it will be presented by two of our fabulous expedition leaders, Lianne Thompson and Heather Chrystie. Ladies, thank you so much for being here today. This sounds like a really fun and fascinating topic. Thanks for bringing it to us. I know there's a lot to discuss, so I will turn it right over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sunny. Yes, exactly. Today we're going to chat about sheep, the history of sheep in England, and all of the good, the bad, and the woolly. I have to say it again because it's a really fun title. Before we dive into that, we thought that we would start off with introducing ourselves. Heather and I do tend to experience some delays with our slide transitions when we have our cameras on, which is why we've opted to have them off just to make the presentation run a bit smoother. So just to explain that right off the bat. But yes, I am Lianne Thompson. So yes, an expedition leader for Natural Habitat Adventures. I do guide in Churchill for both the polar bears and Northern Lights seasons. I also guide in Iceland, as well as, of course, the Cotswolds trips and the Canadian Rockies. Both the Cotswolds and Canadian Rockies trips are brand new trips. They've not yet run. They've been on my schedule for a couple of years now, and I am super excited to finally get them underway. I am actually, even though I don't have an accent, you'll hear in a minute, Heather does. I actually was born in England, so I have a lot of family in England and stuff there, and was most recently there in the fall of last year, actually after I finished up my Iceland season. So I'm really excited to get back there, and in the meantime, talk about the Cotswolds programs, which we actually leave for very soon. They happen so soon, and I cannot wait. But yeah, my name's Lianne. But I'll let Heather introduce herself.
Alrighty, thanks, Lianne, and hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today to talk about sheep in England. As Lianne mentioned, my name is Heather, and I do have a British accent because that is where I grew up. I've been working for NatHab for something like 8 or 9 years now, in Churchill, doing the polar bear trips, doing the Northern Lights trips, working in Iceland over the summers. And I'll be, just like Lianne, starting out on the Cotswolds program, the brand new Cotswolds program, in just a couple of weeks here. I also live in the Canadian Rockies, and so that's why you see that one there on my slide. And so maybe one day I'll get to guide those NatHab trips here too. But at the moment, I'm just a little bit too busy in the summer to fill it up with all those different things. And so yeah, that's a little bit about me. But I think we'll just dive right into our main topic here, because we've got a lot of interesting things to cover today. And I'd like to start out by introducing you to the British landscape. This is what it looks like today. It really is, in the words immortalized by William Blake, it really is England's green and pleasant land. It's recognizable and unique, and mainly for that really precise patchwork of beautiful green fields that we see all over the rural areas of England. And divided by these rich hedgerows and fences separating and dividing the land into kind of a precise patchwork of privately owned places. In this landscape, of course, we have a large amount of farming, whether it be sheep and cows or arable farming as well. But we do also have about 150,000 miles of rights of way and public footpaths across the United Kingdom. So although it is mostly a privately owned country, we do still have aspirate and an extensive network of trails to access our countryside on. However, it's coming to light at the moment in the aftermath of a recent book release. It's called Who Owns England, written by Gary Shrubsole. He pointed out that 50% of English land is actually owned by less than 1% of the population. Namely, that 1% is comprised mostly of aristocratic families who've passed the land through the family for generations, and wealthy entrepreneurs. People like James Dyson, for example, do own large tracts of the United Kingdom. That means that those people, it's a relatively small number of people owning a very large percentage of the land itself. They have a skewed power to make decisions and to make changes on this landscape which is really the home of other people. So this is becoming a big topic in the United Kingdom at the moment, especially in the climate that we have at the moment, where environmental decisions need to be made in a timely manner on a local and a national level. So it's becoming a very important debate as to who owns England and who gets to make these decisions that we have to make for the future. And so that's really the motivation behind us starting to talk about the British landscape, what it looks like today, and specifically how it came to look and to be owned in the way that it is today. How did that happen? What is the history? And in order to cover that topic, I would like to start back in the 12th century. I would like to take a look at what the landscape used to look like compared to what it looks like today, and talk about the very different farming practices that were in operation in the 12th century itself. So what you see on the screen here is a diagram of what was termed the open or the three-field farming system. And this was a system where, although the land itself was mostly still owned by the lord of the manor or the kind of nearby aristocracy for the area, there was also a lot of rights for the common people, or people who lived in the villages, to access and to use the land that surrounded their village. So you can see on the left-hand side here, this is divided into the three fields, the one for wheat and rye, the one for oats and beans, and the one for fallow land, land which is resting for a season to replenish the soil and also to grow winter fodder for animals. So three main fields. Within those fields, you can see the stripes on the picture here, and each farmer, each tenant farmer in the village would be allocated a strip from the field. As you became a more wealthy farmer, as you reaped profit from the land that you were farming, you could buy the rights to have more than one strip, and so that you could grow more wheat or more oats. And at the same time that you were growing your crops in these three fields, you also had access to the common land down in the bottom left-hand corner of this area here. The commons were where the villagers would graze their livestock, whether that be cows or sheep or horses and oxen to help with cultivating the land. And everybody would have access to this common and shared grazing land. Similarly, out in the top left here, you can see represented the forests. Forests were, for the most part, of course, still owned by the lords of the manor, but villagers had the rights to go in and to harvest wood, to bring back firewood for their houses, to hunt for things like rabbits. For the most part, they were not allowed to hunt for things like deer, which were deemed the property of the aristocracy themselves, but they could hunt and supplement their diet with smaller creatures from the forest. So for this village surrounded by this ultimately common land, that meant that they were able to practice a high degree of self-sufficiency. Right, around their houses in the village, they could grow vegetables and keep bees and pigs and things like that, just for those extra few things. They'd also keep chickens for eggs. And if they needed anything in excess of what could be produced nearby, then they could trade at the local markets. And so throughout large parts of English history, this was the system that was used. People had widespread access to the land, even though it was still privately owned, and the rights to go and harvest and to farm on this land were legally defensible. It was written that they were allowed to do that, and the lords of the manor did not at that time have the power to stop the villagers from providing for themselves from the land. And so, of course, a system like this, widespread across the United Kingdom, it did have many benefits and some disadvantages as well. Its benefits, of course, all the villagers would work together. So it was very supportive of a community feeling, and everybody knew each other, would go out at the same times of the year to do the harvest. And the land was relatively equally shared, and everybody had the capacity to help each other. Everybody had access to land to grow food, which meant that for the most part, people could maintain a healthy diet and feed themselves well. And it's also quite an environmentally friendly farming model. It's also part of the downsides of this system as well, is that in today's terms, we might say that there's quite a lot of wasted space In a system like this, you can imagine that in order to access their strip of land, the farmers needed a network of paths that covered the open fields, and that would enable them to get to where they needed to go to farm their strip of land. But of course, it meant that land had to be reserved for those access routes as well. So a little bit of so-called wasted space there. And it also needed space to turn around the oxen at the end of their plow route, which if you have a larger field, you can do that in a more efficient way. So this so-called wasted space was actually quite beneficial for wildlife because it allows for a diversity of species and to support pollinators and other small members of the wildlife community that would struggle in the actual cultivated part of the field. It maintains uncultivated sections even in the cultivated field, which is an environmental advantage but a productivity disadvantage. And to talk a few more disadvantages here, of course, there are no hedges or fences in this system. So we'll talk a little bit about the importance of hedges in the latter parts of this presentation here. And it's also very hard for them to apply proper drainage systems across the communal fields. Right? It required a really high level of communication. It was often overseen by an organization called the manorial court, or a court presided over by the local lord of the manor. And because the land of one individual farmer was in several different fields, 3 different fields to be exact, it meant that they had to travel between those places, right? So they used up more time than maybe was necessary to get from the place where they were growing oats to the place where they were growing wheat, and then over to the place where they were keeping their sheep. So a little bit of a downside there. And the other real disadvantage to this system is that with that communal structure and that emphasis on self-sufficiency, it was very difficult to take advantage of any new farming techniques, right? If everybody was happy and everybody was well fed, there wasn't a huge amount of motivation for the common people or the tenant farmers in the system to maximize and to take advantage of new agricultural discoveries and innovations. So it was a system that you could say was fairly set in its ways. But we would like to bring this back around to sheep here, right? How do sheep fit into the open field or the 3-field system that was in operation in the UK for centuries? And the answer is that they were very, very much a part of the open field system. Sheep had been farmed in the UK for many centuries by the time we got to this time period of the 12th century. And they were partly responsible by this point already for changing the landscapes of British Highlands. British Highlands have been grazed heavily for hundreds, if not thousands of years, which has altered the vegetation and the ecology of those regions. And sheep, even in the 12th century, were a big part of that shift in diversity and habitat. Sheep were originally brought across from Europe, and they've actually been in the United Kingdom for something since somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 years BC. So they've been a real part of the countryside for literally thousands of years. They are native to Mesopotamia or present-day Middle East, and their ancient relative is the mouflon, if you've heard of that. So they've all descended from that same common ancestor, but in response to all the varied ecological regions of the UK, whether it's highlands or hills or lowlands and plains that we have in the southeast of the country, many localized breeds have sprung up from that common ancestor. So even today in England, we have something around 60 different breeds of sheep that are all specifically adapted to different local climates. Throughout history, if we go back to Roman times, then sheep were an incredibly important part of the economy of the United Kingdom at that point. And in fact, in Roman times, the United Kingdom and Spain were considered capitals of wool production, and wool profits were used by the kings of those regions to finance not just expansion of the empire and battles with their neighbors, but also in the years following, exploration into the New World and things like that. So the taxes that were levied on the wool trade that was booming in the United Kingdom for hundreds of years were used to further the nation on the international stage. In England, the cloth mills were a big part of the country's economy, and that was the part of the economy that was really kind of staying in the local towns. So they would take the wool and manufacture it into a high quality cloth that could be sold in the cities and the towns around, but it wasn't a huge export product, that cloth. And instead, the raw wool itself, which in England was considered to be a very, very high quality, was much in demand for cloth makers in other parts of Europe, mainly over in what is now the Netherlands. And they had a high demand for British wool to make, again, a very high quality cloth. And as that demand for British wool grew, then of course it had to fuel a change on the ground in the United Kingdom. Right? Sheep were part of the traditional farming methods, and I would say there were not many farmers in England in the 12th century who did not have sheep. But productivity was not maximized, right? Because of that three-field, open-field system, lack of motivation to maximize for the small farmer on the ground. And in fact, that self-sufficient farming kind of stood in the way of maximizing productivity. And that led to a move for the aristocracy, the owners of the land, to begin to manage their estates in different ways to maximize their own personal profits. Now, of course, the most efficient way to maximize your profits in the 12th century and beyond was to have more sheep. And as their numbers of sheep in the UK rose, that triggered the change from this open field system that you can see represented on the screen right here, land divided into strips available for everybody to use. It triggered the shift into a landscape much more like the one that we see today, right? Divided into private parcels of land, and with the profits being reaped by far fewer people than they were in the past. Now, Lianne is going to dive a bit deeper into what those changes driven by sheep really meant for the common person living in the UK at the time. However, before I finish my section here, I would like to share with you a quote from a book. It was a socio-political satire called Utopia. The author is Thomas More. It was published in the United Kingdom in 1551, which was actually 35 years after Thomas More wrote this book, and 16 years after the author's death by execution for treason. And this quote, I think, sums up some of the concerns for the lower class of people and the people who are adversely affected by the shift towards maximum sheep production in the UK. And Thomas More wrote this. He said, "Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and so tame and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. They consume, destroy, and devour whole fields, houses, and cities. For look, in what parts of the realm does grow the finest and therefore dearest wool? There, the noblemen and gentlemen, not contenting themselves with the yearly revenues and profits that were wont to go to their forefathers, not being content that they live in rest and pleasure, they enclose all into pastures, they throw down houses, they pluck down towns, and they leave nothing standing, but only the church to be made into a sheep house."
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Heather. So as she'd mentioned, yes, there was this move towards the introduction of having enclosures, essentially having these hedgerows, having fence lines that enabled one person to kind of be in control of the land rather than this open field system, open farm system. So yeah, it was moving towards land becoming consolidated into individually owned or rented fields. And so when they were originally looking at doing this, the agreements, the enclosures of land actually took place through informal agreements. So just, you know, yeah, very informal conversations and stuff being had to make it so that this land was being divided up. But as sheep numbers increased, as profitability increased, there was a need for having more formal agreements to understand how the land was being divided up. The idea of creating more legal protection over lands was introduced when this widespread farming and expansion was happening. And in 1604, the Enclosure Acts began. And so these were legal rights to property, to the areas that had been previously held in common land. And so they would have these individual enclosure acts every single time a person was going to be enclosing a land. So between the years of 1604, when this began, and 1914, over 5,200 enclosure acts were enacted by Parliament. So this related to just over a fifth of the total land area of England, amounting to some 6.8 million acres that were now owned and protected by individuals. And most commonly when this was happening, it was doing so by wealthy farmers. So you can imagine that that then leads to some issues. It was largely wealthy people who were buying up the land, and this has many ramifications down the line. So the Enclosure Acts, while they did have some positives, we're going to get to those afterwards, there are negatives, specifically with the idea of it being wealthy farmers. So they caused a shift in the land availability among different classes of people. So as Heather was saying initially, people would own these strips of land and it was kind of much more communal, but now you can imagine those with money were able, more stature, were able to buy up more of the land. And so the greatest increases in the use of enclosures came from during the enclosure movement of the 18th and 19th century, when there was just an absolute massive surge of wealthy landowners enclosing common lands for their own use, and profiting off of that, as Heather mentioned, with mainly the sheep, increased productivity, everything like that. So these enclosures meant fencing off the land to only one farmer. They had the right to raise crops, and this did end up having disastrous consequences for the poor. Enclosures, despite increasing productivity, resulted in also an increase in poverty, rural depopulation, and homelessness. So essentially what it was doing was all of these smaller farmers or community members, the ones who didn't have all the money to buy these massive pockets of land, were being forced to give up farming and actually migrate to centralized locations, places like industrialized cities and towns, because they had to go and find other work. They were no longer able to do farming, to do the thing that had been profitable and supplying for their families and their livelihoods for many years. And so instead they were having to go into cities, work in factories, and work in mines. And so many historians actually view or will say that the Enclosure Acts and all of the process of this happening was one of the main causes of the Industrial Revolution. And we've talked about the Industrial Revolution in some of our other webinars when we've discussed things about England. So if you check some of them out, you might be familiar with some of these things already. But in that time frame, there was a decline in human health, overcrowding because of a surge in population, poor working conditions, increased pollution, and a whole lot of other things. And it kind of ended up creating this own little feedback loop in and of itself, in that having the Industrial Revolution made things being produced a lot more efficiently, and so that efficiency meant that there was more available for people. Population grew, which then leads to the need for having more efficient systems, and then more population grows, and it just kind of cycles down and does have some pretty disastrous social consequences. But the introduction of these legal enclosure boundaries through the Enclosure Acts certainly played a really big role in the Industrial Revolution, in the agricultural revolution, in many aspects of how Britain, the economy and social dynamics of Britain kind of evolved over time. But the consequences of the Enclosure Act were not all bad. There was certainly some other things that had happened that were good. So as we mentioned already, they, increased agricultural productivity of farms from the 18th century by bringing more land into effective agricultural potential. So having those strips of land, wasn't as efficient, and so now the land is living up to its potential. So they saw increase in crop yields and livestock output increased at the same time as productivity increased enough to create a surplus of labor. These lands that were earlier used by villagers for grazing their cattle were now converted to agricultural fields, which meant that they could also be increasing in things like grain production. And this was very important because they're needing to keep up with the growing pace of population of Britain. So as I was saying, the massive surge of the population, and so needing to be able to supply enough food, and having these enclosures is great for that because it enabled that higher productivity. Enclosure of lands also led to an increase in soil fertility as the nitrogen content of the soil increased, and this all had a lot to do with just introducing more innovative methods for cultivating and managing their crops and stuff. So things like crop rotation, growing of certain crops nearby each other, all of that, as they learned more about it and learned how to have more productive systems. All of this stuff is quite good for soil rather than just, growing the same individual crop year after year. So they saw an increase in the understanding of farming and how to capitalize on that. So that was a really important thing. Then the landowners began to produce crops not just for local consumption, but because they were being so efficient with having these new methods, they also meant that they had a surplus of things that were available that could then enter the international market. So these enclosure acts that existed that created these boundaries, made things more efficient, then made it so that Britain could enter that international market, and it helped improve the national economy of Britain. So that was certainly one element that is beneficial from these enclosure acts. But another one, which we're going to dive further into today, one of the main advantages that we want to talk about specifically has to do what the enclosures are made of. And you may have heard both Heather and I say the word hedge or hedgerow throughout this presentation, but we haven't really discussed what that is. So fencing is, of course, one component that can be used in England and still is used in England to help with these enclosures, but you may be aware, probably, see pictures of England. We've already seen pictures on the presentation today about England that is incredibly well known for these hedgerows. So hedges have been used as field boundaries in England since the time of the Romans. The Anglo-Saxons as well used hedgerows extensively for estate boundaries. And a lot of these boundaries and hedgerows actually still exist today in England. These early hedges were used as field enclosures or to mark the boundaries of people's properties. But there was actually no specific plan in place for planting hedges. So no structure of all of that in England and farming until enclosures started being used a lot more widespread in England with the introduction of those enclosure acts. So over the centuries, numerous hedges were planted to keep the grazing livestock in, maintain boundaries, all of that kind of stuff. And many of them, as I said, are still in existence today and can be as historic as many of the old churches that are there. So some of the hedgerows that are still present can date back over 800 years old. Some of these things have been in place. So today, Britain boasts about 435,000 miles of hedgerows, a length that actually surpasses that of its roads, which I think is just pretty incredible and really kind of says what the significance is of the hedge and the hedgerows themselves in Britain. But what exactly is a hedgerow? We'll keep talking about that some more. So you see pictures of hedgerows and think that they just look like shrubs, but they're actually a lot more complex than that, very well maintained and managed for many different purposes. So hedges, they'll be really thick and broadest at the bottom. They have a diversity of woolly species. They'll have things like hawthorn, blackthorn, field maple, hazel, wayfaring tree, a whole bunch of different trees, shrubs that are in there. They'll even have some tall trees in there, oak, ash, other tall ones that will kind of be added into the whole anatomy of a hedge, if you will. Ramblers such as bramble and rose are common and seen with things like climbing honeysuckle. At the foot of the hedge, there's also often thick beds of herbs, things like cow parsley, hedge mustard, all of those types of things, and a lot of coarse grasses. They also have margins around the hedges, and so that means that there's an area between the hedge itself and any of like the cultivated and disturbed lands. And so this margin helps to protect the roots and therefore just the structure in general of the hedge. This marginal area is also typically protected from pesticides and fertilizers. And so because of that, it is often seen as a great spot for wildlife, which we'll dive into afterwards. Hedgerows, they can be up on banks. They often have ditches along sides, and these ditches can be, shallow or deep, depending on where it is. They can carry water permanently, seasonally, or just in response to heavy rainfall events. So essentially, when you're looking at these hedgerows, is that they are extremely complex. They're made up of many different species and are very diverse. And so because of how complex they are, it does lead that, or it does kind of tie into the fact that they offer a whole bunch of ecosystem services from just these kind of compact, amazing spaces. And so I'm going to throw it back to Heather again now, who's going to talk about some of those ecosystem services.
Yeah, thanks, Lianne. So as Lianne was saying, these hedgerows that are so effective at separating one flock of sheep from another, along with other livestock as well. And they do offer an incredible number of ecosystem services benefits, and not just to their immediate environment, but to the overall health of the British countryside as an ecosystem unto itself. And they do that because of their complex structure, because of their diversity of life, because they provide homes to a diversity of different animals that if there were no hedges in the United Kingdom, that diversity of different animals arguably would have a very minimized habitat compared to what they have at the moment. And so in terms of these ecosystem services, what exactly is it that these hedgerows are doing? Well, of course, they're containing the livestock and stopping them from being all out all over the road and getting mixed up with each other. But they also provide this incredible windbreak around every single field that's hemmed in by a hedge. You have soil protection. The wind, even if that field is plowed and left open with no cover crop, then it's still relatively protected from the wind by this network of hedges. Not just the soil is protected by that, but it provides protection for the agricultural animals that are contained within as well, and of course protection for the wildlife communities that call the hedgerows home. So the fantastic wind barriers providing shelter and soil protection. And they also, because of the air moving through that dense thicket of plants, they provide an element of air pollution capturing. Because plants will effectively filter and clean the air, right? We've all felt it when you walk into a forest and take a deep breath. The air is just much cleaner and fresher than it is outside of the forest, away from all that vegetation. And on a slightly smaller scale, hedgerows also provide that air cleansing service to us, at least in the immediate environs of the hedge itself. As Lianne mentioned, hedgerows often have ditches on either side, which can help with flood mitigation, but it's also the plants themselves that have their habitat in the hedgerow that can help to mitigate floods in the flood season. Because of the fact that they're growing with their roots deep into the ground, their leaves will intercept the falling raindrops and reduce the erosional impact of that raindrop hitting the ground. And They also slow down the water, right? The flow of the water across the landscape, encourage more absorption into the water table, and really just slow down the flood response during a storm event, meaning that we don't have, in areas that have effective hedgerow systems, you don't have as much of a flash flood risk. Instead, it's a slower event where water levels can rise and fall, causing less damage to the local area because of the flood mitigation services of the hedgerow itself. Lots of people who live in areas that have hedges benefit from the fact that there's a lot of noise reduction from having that thick hedgerow. These things can be tens of 20s of feet across, and so they really are an imposing barrier. As a child, certainly I loved hedges because you could crawl around inside them and build dens and hide from all the grown-ups, so it was pretty fun. But they're also really great at cutting the noise from nearby roads. And so if you do have a busy road in England, it's often got, if not a wall, then definitely a hedgerow growing alongside it and providing a better living environment really for the people who are nearby. There's been studies done as well that say that hedgerows reduce stress levels in human beings through visually stimulating us, so providing support for the human population as well. And they also provide a service called phytoremediation, or kind of the cleaning of soil pollutants, because the sheer diversity of plants that are contained within this hedgerow is able to process a variety of different compounds that might end up in the soil through industrial activity or something like that. So the hedgerow does provide that cleaning service, not just for the air, but for the soil as well, resulting in better soil quality. And there's also been a lot of talk recently about climate change and hedgerows, because there is such a huge network of them. It's a very significant part of the British countryside. And hedges, because of their prolific growth of vegetation, can provide carbon sequestration. And so the International Committee on Climate Change does advocate the increase of hedgerows in the United Kingdom. And they do aim to increase that network by 40%, which means adding 200,000 kilometres of new hedgerows across Britain. And this is something which is making traditional hedge layers, hedge laying is an absolute skill, and it's making them very happy because, of course, their trade, if we don't want new hedges, then their trade is something that's disappearing. So the move to include new hedges, not just maintaining old ones, is kind of reviving a traditional industry in the United Kingdom. And if they did add that 200,000 kilometres of new hedgerows in the next 10 years or so, that would equate to adding hedgerows that are about half the length of Britain's entire road network. And hopefully we'll be able to see some carbon sequestration and climate change benefits from that move. Alongside all of these benefits that I've already mentioned, there's also a huge amount of support and habitat for wildlife in these hedges. So it's not just plants that has a habitat here. In fact, hedges, especially in urban environments where there's maybe not as much other habitat available to the small wildlife of the United Kingdom, the hedges are considered absolutely crucial in supporting the diversity of animal species. They provide shelter for nesting sites, places to find food, and essentially corridors for movement around the countryside. Right? These are, when you look from the air down on the English countryside and you see the way that the hedges join up with each other, it lends a whole new meaning to the term wildlife corridor. And it's not much wider than a human corridor, but it is very much the animal kingdom rather than the human kingdom that reigns inside the dynamics of a hedgerow itself. And they're actually considered so important for movement and supported habitat for wildlife that the environmental secretary in the UK has actually called them important ecological building blocks. And that's why the British government is supporting post-Brexit agriculture and the subsidy system to encourage farmers to better maintain the hedges that they have and, as I mentioned, to build new ones as well. So there is a new scheme now in the post-Brexit British world that's offering farmers £24. I think that's something close to about $40 per 100 metres of hedgerows. that they maintain or build. So a little extra income source for our farmers in the UK to support these traditional methods of enclosure, originally becoming so extensive across the UK because of sheep. So some of the wildlife that is within these hedgerows is something that Lianne is going to, I think, quickly touch upon here. And we'd like to introduce you just quickly to a few of the species that live in the British hedgerows.
Yes, awesome. Thanks, Heather. Yeah, so we'll talk about just a couple of the species. There are many that we could discuss here, but we'll just highlight a couple of them. The first one we'll start with is a bird called a dunnock. There are many bird species that will use hedgerows for different things, but we want to talk about the dunnock just because it's quite funny. These guys are also often actually called a hedge sparrow, even though they are not a sparrow, but given that nickname, you can understand how prolific and how often that they are seen within these hedgerows. They do require them for they use the shelter and structure of the hedge to kind of gain protection, find food, as well as mates. And the mating is the funny part that we'll talk about today. Finding mates, especially interesting for the dunnock. They are hailed as having one of the most interesting sex life of any British bird. What a great title to have obtained. They do practice monogamy as well as polygamy freely, which does create some very interesting mating displays. So one of them involves a process called cloaca pecking. So the cloaca is an opening, and it's for the bird's digestive system, urinary tract, and reproduction tract. It's where they'll lay eggs from. We won't dive into bird anatomy right now, but we'll go back to cloaca pecking, this very interesting mating ritual. And essentially what it is that when males will peck at the female's cloaca to try and remove sperm from other males that she has maybe possibly mated with. Very exciting world in the dunnocks. And it's very promiscuous, promiscuous, man, that word is hard for me today. Behavior means that the paternity of chicks is often a bit of a mystery. And females use that to their advantage because now they'll get fed actually from multiple different males. However, the males will actually vary their feeding schedule depending on how certain they are of paternity. So if a male has had greater access to a female throughout a specific breeding season, they then know that they have a higher chance of fertilization, and therefore these chicks may be their own offspring, and they're more likely to provide ample amounts of care to their young. So I just find that system to be quite entertaining, but they do rely heavily on hedges, as I said, for shelter and food production. They do tend to eat a lot of insects, which is where we'll head into next. So for bees and many other insects, many other pollinator species, but hedges are vital for healthy, diverse wild pollinator populations. Really important for farmland as well. Hedges attract and support pollinators, boosting their numbers, and in turn, these pollinators do offer a whole lot of services to farm fields and orchards that are there around by improving the pollination of crops and, again, helping to increase the yields that the farmers will obtain. And so what makes these hedges so important for pollinators, you might kind of already be able to recognize it just with me mentioning several of the species that have been present in there, several of those different flowering plant species in there. So first thing that's great for pollinators is that they are a good source of pollen and nectar. So they're good for food from spring right through to autumn. Many crops that are in fields are actually only kind of blooming or in, providing food during a small window of time throughout a growing season, but these hedges are often designed in a way that there's many different flowers and shrubs and trees included within that ecosystem, and they flower at different times of year. So flowers of the hedgerow and the margins as well, they're really important for pollinators. It provides a whole lot of food for these pollinator species, but they also do give them a place for resting and for habitat as well. Not only is it for food during and rest during the flowering season, but they'll also use the hedges for breeding and overwintering space as well. So other animals like mice, voles, they will also live in the hedges, and they end up kind of creating all of these holes at the base of the hedge, and that's perfect overwintering habitat for bees and other pollinators. So hedges provide an abundance of breeding habitat as well as these overwintering habitats, but the breeding habitat can be interesting too, because the vegetation can be used to support breeding. Oftentimes there's rotting vegetation, and this is the perfect spot for pollinators and insects to be depositing their larvae on, because it means that when they're hatching, or when they're coming, you know, when the larvae are in need of food, there's food all around them. And one of the other things that's really interesting about the hedgeways is that they provide safe flyways, is what they call them. And essentially what that means is that pollinators and bats, which we'll get into next too, they both use these hedges as corridors, as Heather mentioned, but also just in terms of like helping to guide their path when they are flying. Oftentimes insects, bats, they don't like just flying around in open space, and they'd much rather follow linear structures. And so having hedges where they're sheltered from wind and from rain, and makes them safer for predators. So they use them to help guide them from one place to another, but it is a really important component for many different species. And so we've also got this barbastelle bat. They're incredibly rare, protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981. They're listed as near threatened globally, and so protection of them is really important. So yeah, they fly. Hedgerows play a really important role in directing those flying routes. They also do, as I've mentioned, they provide homes for many insects, and bats do feed on these insects. So it's really important to be kind of protecting these habitats for animals we know that it's really important for. So there's thought to be as few as 5,000 of these barbastelle bats still in the UK. And with hedgerows comprising a really important foraging habitat, it's really important for that protection to happen. With the insect pollinators, they're estimated, like with bees, if you look at bees specifically too, you know, we often hear a lot about bee species decline. We're losing species, and those that we still do have, the species are declining. 23 out of the 260 bee species in the UK have already gone extinct since the 1800s. So it's really important that we maintain healthy populations of the ones that are there. Bees, butterflies, flies, all of these types of things are really important food opportunities for bats. And so in protecting the hedgerow habitat, we're protecting bees, we're protecting pollinator species that also are providing an immense amount of dollar value. It's estimated that crop pollination alone by these pollinator species worth over $430 million, or million pounds, sorry, a year to the UK economy. So pollinator species important for crops, yielding better productivity, but also really important for supporting some critically endangered or threatened animals as well. Bat species, there is a massive decline of bats as well going on, largely kind of due to the loss of habitat. And so being able to have these hedgerows that we know provide ample habitat for species as well as their food is something that is incredibly important to be doing. So all of that sounds wonderful. Hedgerow does create, but unfortunately there are, you know, issues that are created with hedgerows. You know, we've talked a lot about the specifics, how these animals are supported, what types of plants might be found within, and so you probably are thinking, hey, how do you maintain all of that? And that you're correct, they do need to be maintained, and that can be quite a costly endeavor to do, because in order for them to remain productive for birds, for bats, for bees, all of that kind of stuff, it's really important that they're maintained in a way that is still being productive, or is still providing all of those ecosystem services. So hedge trimming is something that happens, but often requires a lot of special machinery and very skilled workers. So hedgerow management can be expensive. One of the other downfalls that they'll find, we've talked about species of animals that do live there. I've only talked about the ones that provide wonderful things and we enjoy, but of course, hedgerows can also shelter pests. One of the things that people will often pessimists about hedgerows in general talk about is rabbits. So these hedgerows can support rabbit populations, which then come in and damage crops. And especially if hedgerows are not being maintained properly, they can shade out crop areas and then create uneven ripening and disease. So there are some negatives, but despite some of these challenges, the good does far outweigh the bad. And so ecologists, both in areas of Europe where hedgerows are very commonplace, and ecologists in areas where hedgerows are kind of more recently being adapted. California is one of them that's looking at some of these things. I don't know a whole lot about how California is adapting to them or is integrating them into their areas, but I found somewhere that they were talking about introducing them to there. So ecologists have viewed these man-made structures as really important ecosystems that are also helpful with agricultural management. And we've kind of already mentioned that there is a disappearance of many miles of English hedgerow because it's easier for modern farmers to string up metal fences than it is to maintain these ancient hedgerows. Conservation efforts have introduced incentives, as Heather had already mentioned, and there's a growing momentum to try and expand hedgerows. And in fact, many of them are becoming more legally protected, and some of this has to do with, some of these ones that have been around for hundreds of years, how high they are, what they're made of, all of that kind of stuff, but it can garner some legal protection for the hedgerow themselves. Several nonprofit campaigns are also trying to boost hedgerow abundance. And as Heather mentioned, that they are trying to increase the hedgerow network by 40% within the next 50 years. So really just want to, again, talk about how important hedgerows are, that even the government, branches of government are talking about how much they need to increase the hedgerow network. For climate and biodiversity benefits, there's a lot of benefits that they're gaining from them. All that is to say that hedgerows, they're gaining in popularity and now being more valued for what they are. When I first started looking at hedgerows, who knew that you could do we could continue talking about hedgerows for much longer, but we're already running out of time. There's so much that's going on with hedgerows. And so being able to actually be recognized and valued for what they are. So hopefully we'll see an increase in hedgerows throughout the UK, but it's probably important that we now circle back to the sheep, which I'll throw it back to Heather for.
Cool, thanks, Lianne. So really, folks, so far we've had a story of how sheep farming, staple of the British countryside and agriculture for thousands of years, underwent this revolution that led to the formation, really, of the British landscape that we see today, right? That enclosure movement that Lianne was talking about, separating the land with these beautiful hedges, and that, as we've learned, is so essential to the maintenance and the continuation of wildlife habitat in the UK today. And it's really one of my favorite things about talking about nature in England is that everything feels very much interconnected, be it the natural world or the human world, be it agriculture or wildlife, and the two really go hand in hand and have a lot to answer for each other, with the way that they develop, the way that they change, the threats and the challenges and the opportunities as well. And so I hope that so far through our presentation, you've kind of got a feel for that. We've talked about historical agriculture and we've talked about modern biodiversity kind of in the same breath, because they are so interrelated to each other. And of course, the sheep in particular have an awful lot to answer for in the United Kingdom and forming the landscape that we see today. And so really where I would like to finish off and wrap up our presentation is to come back around to these beautiful sheep and talk about what their future in the United Kingdom looks like. Because of course sheep farming does continue in the UK today, but unfortunately the days of sheep farmers being wealthy men are somewhat, at least at the moment, in the past. profits in the wool industry are not at all what they once were, and of course that wool industry has declined, hitting the economy itself quite hard. Another threat to the practice of sheep farming in the United Kingdom is the rise of cheaper imported meat, and lamb from New Zealand has hit supermarket shelves across the UK and outcompetes the prices of British raised lamb as well. So it is an industry that many would say is struggling at this point. We do still have 60 different breeds of sheep present in the United Kingdom, all, as I was saying before, adapted to different regions. And we do continue to produce high quality wool products. Certainly on our Cotswolds adventure, we will be talking a lot about wool and having the opportunity to buy some very high quality British made wool. But of course, because there is more wool being produced than there is demand for at the moment, things like sweaters, you only need so much wool for it, right? So there is talk in the wool industry and the sheep farming industry about diversifying their markets to supply things like the need for environmentally conscious house insulation. You can use wool as an insulator in the walls of your home. You can also use natural wool as a garden pest control assistant. So there's a lot of different opportunities that are being explored by the wool industry in an effort to support sheep farmers in England. There are still about 40,000 people who farm sheep, but the general consensus is that this lifestyle choice to be a sheep farmer, whether it's on the hills or down on the relatively rich and fertile lowlands, it's a lifestyle choice that gets harder for the farmer every year. It is a full-time commitment to raise sheep, and it's a relatively small financial return as well with the state of the market as it is today. Farmers have to work all hours during the lambing season, often in very inclement weather and out in the open as well. And they also have to deal with not just sheep shearing, protecting their flock, maintaining their hedgerows and their enclosures, fluctuating market prices. There's an uncertainty of how much return they'll actually get. And there's also a constant threat of inconsistencies like disease, the foot and mouth disease that happened in 2010 and decimated British farms. And there's always the threat of things like that happening again. Not to dwell too much on the doom and gloom of this, but following Brexit in the UK, England and the whole of the UK is withdrawing from the Common Agricultural Policy, that's Europe's farming subsidy program, which really means huge changes in the structure of subsidies for farmers in general and, of course, sheep farmers. For sheep farmers, this is a real concern because up to 90% of their business income, that's 90%, can come from subsidies. At the moment, they're looking at those subsidies being cut in half by 2024, but they will be replaced by a UK subsidy program, which is in its formulation stages at the moment. And so at the moment, now in 2022, some farmers are able to apply for pilot schemes, which are grants under what's going to be known as the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is a British-based subsidy program to replace that Common Agricultural Policy. It's going to be introduced properly in 2024, and the general consensus is that it will provide more support for environmental considerations alongside farming. It's not clear at all how comparable the amount of money that farmers actually get will be, and there are many farmers who have concerns about this, as the current environmental subsidies are hard to qualify for and can be quite unreliable. However, whichever way it goes, for the farming industry in the UK in general and sheep farmers in particular, I think it's very fair to say that the stage is set at the moment for another shift in British agriculture, just like the one we saw where everything was enclosed and the production of sheep rose so much. And we have the stage set for another shift now, and all of us will have front row seats to that change. In my mind, we can only hope that the changes in land management not only support the traditional farming in the United Kingdom, but also are to the advantage of the environment, because although they often don't, the two can go hand in hand. And so hopefully with these new environmental land management schemes and a progressive look at the future of farming and wildlife in the United Kingdom, then the British countryside and its hedges can continue to play host to a diversity of creatures, both wild and domesticated, into the future. That's my hope. And I hope that you share it. We can talk about this a lot more during our Cotswolds trips, because of course talking about the wool trade is very central to that region itself. And for now, though, we're reaching the end of our time, and so we'll wrap it up here. And I think maybe we have time for a couple of questions.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. I don't think I was prepared to be as captivated by sheep and hedgerows as I actually was. Before this, I think my only relationship to the word hedgerow was from Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven lyrics, and now I'm a complete fan, so thank you. There's plenty of people here who agree with me that this was awesome, and fortunately, since we don't have a lot of time, fortunately you guys were so thorough, a lot of the questions were answered as you continued. But one question, I don't know if you have an answer for this, but why didn't the English settlers bring hedgerows to the United States? They seem like such a cool idea and so useful. Is there any history on that?
That is a great question. I would imagine that it has to do with how labor intensive a hedge can be. Right? When you come over to the New World, there was a abundance of space compared to the fairly cramped environment of the United Kingdom by comparison. And so I don't know for sure. It's not something that I read much about. But I would imagine that it had to do with the fact that when you're enclosing so much more land over here, larger fields and fewer people, then you probably went for something that was a little bit less labor intensive.
You're right. That makes a lot of sense.
I would maybe add on to that just, again, this is also just a speculation, perhaps has to do with climate and how different it is in the UK versus some of the areas where people were, first coming over. Harsh winters have different plants that are able to thrive, and so probably just not all of the knowledge of what is useful in the UK would translate directly over to North America. So.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Well, I'm excited to know that they're at least looking into it in California. That's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
Another very important question: do hedgehogs live in hedgerows?
They sure do.
Oh.
Hedgehogs get their name from hedgerows. So the hedge part obviously translates directly, and then the hog part of the hedgehog name comes from the fact that hedgehogs, they make this kind of really cute, grumbly, snorty type noise when they're foraging. It sounds just like a little tiny pig. So that's where we get the name hedgehog from.
If you want to learn more about hedgehogs and other small mammals, we did a webinar on that last week.
Oh, you did? I wasn't hosting that one, so I'll have to go back and watch it.
Yeah. So we talk all about hedgehogs and harvest mice and badgers and beavers. So we just kind of did some profiles on some of the small mammal species you can see in the UK. So
fabulous, fabulous. Okay, let's see. We have time for probably one more question. How many species of sheep do you anticipate folks might see in a NatHab trip with you in the Cotswolds?
So in the Cotswolds, we probably won't see all 60 of these different varieties of sheep. Some of the most distinctive types of sheep are up more in the Highlands, where you see it like this little chap here. I think is a Herdwick sheep. They're typical of the Cumbria region, the Lake District, and places like that. And so we will see sheep that are specifically adapted to the more gentle landscape of the Cotswolds. Very beautiful sheep, but we won't see very many different kinds of sheep. Does that answer that?
We will see a lot of sheep. Many of the trails that we go walking through will be enclosed by hedgerows and housing sheep. So it's really fun. Now you have a little bit more background information, and we'll dive more into it when we're out in the field.
That sounds awesome. Thanks again for bringing us this unusual and, like I said, very captivating, surprisingly captivating topic. Please give us any last comments if you have some.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I just thank you guys for joining us. Hopefully you did really enjoy learning more about sheep and hedgerows, and your brains are now full of all the excitement that has to do with both of them. And hopefully you'll also join us on some of the trips in the Cotswolds, be able to see some of these firsthand, and we'll be able to kind of more in person dissect some of the qualities of a hedgerow, and hopefully find some of the species that are looking or that are living in and around there. So join us on some of the trips out there. You might see Heather or I out there. But thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Hope to see you all soon.
I also want to thank everyone who tuned in. Please join us on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.